you hear me well? Good afternoon, rather, I should say. The minister was just telling me that she's on Sierra Leone time. I seem to be too. My name is Sarah Cliff. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for International Cooperation in New York. I'm very pleased to be welcoming everyone today to this session, which is on prevention as a system. And I'll come back to fully introduce our panel, but I want to welcome Ambassador Martin Kimani, who I see is connected from New York. And we are waiting for our colleague Vasu Gundan, connecting from South Africa, who is having some connection issues, but will be with us in a moment. So let me first of all introduce the purpose of the session. So we often talk about the crying need for upstream conflict prevention, but less specifically on how to work to reduce the risks of violence and conflict. And there are many types of violence that there is a need, as we look around the world today, to adopt better practical prevention solutions. Those include, of course, rising conflict after a long period of a decrease in civil conflict. The last 4 years have seen a new rise at communal levels, national levels, and interstate. Yet 80 to 90% of violence is outside conflict zones, occurring in our homes, in our streets, in our workplaces. Interpersonal violence, urban crime and violence, gender-based violence, for example. 50% of the population of fragile states now live under military regimes following coups d'etats. And many of these countries and others, think of the Sahel, for example, are threatened by violent extremism and by human rights abuses from both state and non-state actors. These challenges are universal, and this is one of the principles of this session. This is why reducing all forms of violence is part of the Sustainable Development Goals, which apply to low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries. And I think that we can safely say that none of our societies are immune from these risks. We do have new evidence on what works and what we know about effective prevention. And the first of these lessons is that prevention really has to be nationally owned and locally rooted. There is no way to support prevention from outside society's own dynamics, that it cannot rely on security alone or development alone, but has to link political security, development, and humanitarian action, that it's most effective when it's a partnership between governments, communities, and local civil society, and that prevention needs to address new challenges, such as polarizing cultural and political narratives. Again, a challenge that is universal, that we see in all our regions. Rising inequality, state capture, the links between climate, displacement, conflict, and violence, and challenges to constitutional order and guarantees. And to discuss some of those topics today, we have three wonderful speakers with us, and I hope that we'll be able to welcome our fourth as we continue the session. First of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Minister Kenye Barley, Minister of Planning for Sierra Leone. Minister Barley was previously with the board of the African Development Bank, and so knows the world of the multilateral development banks very well. She's also the chair of the G7 Plus group of fragile states. And having seen her many times in that context, I know that she is an extraordinarily dynamic chair in the interest of those societies. Pablo de Grave, who is on my far left, really invented the field of transitional justice and work on its practical application, is part of the Commission on War Crimes in Ukraine, but most importantly, in the context of this discussion, leads a major cross-regional project on prevention as a system. Vasu Gundan, who we hope to be welcoming from South Africa, is the executive director of Accord, the African Centre for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, played a key role in the anti-apartheid transition, and now mediates and leads thinking on conflict reduction across the continent. And last, Ambassador Martin Kimani is Kenya's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations. I think that few people will have missed his 2022 speech in the Security Council on the invasion of Ukraine, on the event of the invasion of Ukraine, which made parallels with the history of colonialism. And he is a global expert in the context of this discussion on preventing violent extremism. So with that, it's my pleasure to go, first of all, to Minister Barley, and to ask you, Minister, if you could talk about some of the lessons from the New Deal, one of the core documents of the G7 Plus, on what makes for effective nationally led violence prevention strategies.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. And I'd also like to thank the organizers in general for inviting me to my 5th panel, I think. So I think I didn't even need any introduction. We would have saved time if you didn't introduce me. But I'm privileged to at least to give my own perspectives on prevention within the context of, well, the G7 Plus, but more specifically Sierra Leone, and also in the context of the New Deal. And I think that the New Deal, adopted in 2011, is more relevant today than it was then, because we have seen an increase in violent conflicts that have been going on. And really, it is our moral duty, at least as actors, both at the global and national level, to engage in measures that prevent conflicts. So through the New Deal, the G7 countries agreed to adhere to a set of principles to prevent conflict and promote peace and build resilience. I won't go through all of the principles because you've asked me to focus on, principle 2. There are 5 principles in 3 categories, but it's the second category you've asked me to focus on in terms of the country-led pathways and strategies. So that's what I will focus on. Experience sharing, lessons learned. But I would like to say that as a precondition for effective conflict prevention, we need to identify the drivers of the conflict. And many of the conflicts around the world are triggered by economic, political, social conditions. You also have external forces that are the main instigators of the conflict, and also the worsening economic conditions can revive seemingly dormant ethnic tensions as well, the ethnic divide. So religious tensions, political tensions, and in Sierra Leone, we identified the root causes of the conflict, which were traced back to governance, lack of transparency, resulting in economic inequality. And so the immediate post-war measures were focused on addressing reforms, government reforms, and which also addressed the root causes of the war. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was agreed within the context of the Lome Peace Accord was key to setting the groundwork for healing and charting the way forward. And the report also addressed the many triggers of the war to improve good governance, a number of reforms, the establishment of a legal board to serve the less privileged, those that felt they didn't have access to justice. And so in Sierra Leone, this has led to Sierra Leone being one of the most peaceful countries post-conflict in Africa, although there have been recently some skirmishes, some incidents of violence, but by and large, we have gone through this conflict, dealt with the issues of the conflict, dealt with the drivers of conflict. And we acknowledge that if we're giving Sierra Leone as an example, we acknowledge that the G7 countries are heterogeneous, from Africa to South America to Southeast Asia. And so one size can't fit all. We have to look at it differently. But at the same time, with the peace building and state building goals are integral to any dialogue for countries to progress. So within the context of peace building and setting up our peace building goals, as the G7 plus, we undertake fragility assessments, that do look at the drivers. And in Sierra Leone in particular, some of the actions from the assessments has resulted in the placement of resident magistrates in all of the districts. We only a few districts in the country had access to justice. And then I spoke about the legal aid board, set up a legal aid board as an example of a conflict prevention measure. So with the implementation of the new deal in Sierra Leone, we can say that it's been largely successful. And it has influenced our national planning policy, which within the new deal, we expect the one vision, one plan to do. And there are a number of recommendations that have been made and have been followed. One of them is the participation of the women and young people in politics. And well, a lot of you may not know that we now, since our recent elections, have the youngest, I believe we have the youngest cabinet in Africa. And most of the ministers in the key ministries, well, except for my ministry and Ministry of Finance, are under 40. Our chief minister is 36 years old. We have ministers now as young as 32 years old. Key ministries, foreign affairs, agriculture. We have young ministries, and we have an increase. We have 30% female representation also in cabinets. So some of these recommendations were really followed, and one or two others, the motivation of security personnel through salary increments. This is another recommendation that has been followed, and also enhancing economic fundamentals. Now, in terms of the overall planning process, I believe that our plan, the plan that we just launched at the end of last month, I could say it's conflict sensitive, because it's based on what we refer to as the five game changers. And if you look at them, they're all in sensitive, conflict sensitive areas, and the enablers, but I'll just refer to because of time, the five game changers. One is feed Salon. The second is human capital development. The third is youth employment. The fourth is technology and infrastructure. And the fifth is transforming the public sector architecture. If you work on all of these, then at least you're likely to reduce conflict in your country. We also have enablers that address governance and accountability, and also climate resilience. So all of these that, I don't know if that was time up or what, but I just want to mention the flagship program. Our flagship program is Feed Salon. And I mentioned yesterday, if you were at that panel, the way that all of the other game changers were central to Feed Salon. And I use this comment that is referred to a number of times. What is it? The hungry man is an angry man. But I noticed that, I forgot to mention gender mainstreaming, but I noticed that somebody tried to be, on the first day, to try to be gender neutral and said a hungry person is an angry person. But I think that we do need some gender disaggregation there. We should stick with a hungry man is an angry man. I agree. And a hungry woman is a resilient woman, because she will go hungry and look for food for her family. And so that's at least is an example of a way we should use women in peace building peace prevention and things like that, because they have a greater tolerance of hunger and less likely to be angry, but to find solutions. So since there isn't much time, but you did ask about donor support, or this does refer to donor support, I would just say that in the development of this plan, there was dialogue with donors and dialogue with also the CSOs. So it did take the form of the sort of planning that we do within the New Deal, and we expect to do the same in the implementation of the plan as well. So.
Thank you so much, Minister. I hope that some of your points about the youth of political leadership are heard in other arenas, including perhaps where we're sitting today. I want to just underline a couple of points that you made that I thought were very, very important. So one is that you talked about worsening economic conditions can revive seemingly dormant conflicts between ethnic or religious or other identities. And I think with rising inequality across the world in the last 20 years, but more particularly in the last 4 years since the pandemic, we are really seeing the risks of this. In what you talked about on the plan, both since the conflict and the current plan that's just been launched, I thought this was fascinating that you did not talk only about development, classic development issues, although those were very central, but also about measures in the justice arena and the security arena, and the links between those are important. So I'm going to go next to Pablo de Graef, but just before I do that, I want to recognize that we have Vasu Gundan, my dear colleague, with us. Vasu, I'm glad you were able to connect. Pablo, could you talk to us a little bit about how what Minister Bale just said resonates with the research that you've been doing across all regions for a period of time?
So thank you very much for the invitation to participate. And I must say that if I mess up, I do not have the excuse that the minister has of having been in 5 meetings before. I'm messing up on my own accord. So what you said actually is a perfect segue to the research that we have been doing for the last 3 or 4 years with a team of around 200 globally dispersed practitioners and academics. And when I talk about global dispersion, I really mean it. It's about 25% in each of the 4 major regions of the world, thinking about what within the UN system has been talked about for decades, but never fully accomplished, which is to think about a broad and upstream prevention policy, how to think about not just prevention as a crisis management tool, but long before countries reach that stage. Once you do that, and once you think about what happens at an everyday level, so well illustrated by the minister just now, at the national level, there is very effective preventive action that is taking place on an everyday basis. But those conversations never reach the multilateral and the international stage, which is fixated on the role of international actors. And therefore, the topic of prevention in general awakens a great deal of resistance on the part of member states, because they think that this is a backdoor excuse for intervention in their national affairs. So the project has focused exclusively on prevention at the national level, trying to broaden and to upstream the set of tools that are available for effective prevention, motivated by the following considerations. First, I think that it is very important to preserve the universality of the topic. This is not a project in which the North is trying to teach the South how to conduct its own business, but rather a project which is trying to capture the diversity of measures that are taken by different countries in order to try to prevent violations of human rights, violence, and eventually conflict. Secondly, it is motivated by all the sociological argument that sustainable social change is not simply a question of clever institutional engineering, as important as institutions are, but that, as the minister also pointed out, sustainable social change also involves changes in economic opportunities, in societal relations, but even in cultural and personal dispositions. So we are trying to create a comprehensive framework of prevention for upstream prevention that includes institutional changes, such as, for example, we are examining why is it that so many of the so-called guarantor institutions, those autonomous institutions that provide oversight and that are created in order to try to help countries keep their constitutional promises, why is it that they are so much under attack? And what is the role, the preventive role that they play? We are examining about what is the effect of state capture in diminishing the capacity of countries to prevent certain types of violence. But at the same time, for instance, we are trying to think about in the cultural sphere, what is it that the manipulation of history for divisive purposes manifests about the state of the capacities for prevention in a given country? And the final point that I will make is that we are interested not just in reproducing thematic silos, but also thinking about the horizontal relationship between the different topics. There is indeed a relationship between the effective of, for example, constitutional institutions, some cultural dispositions, of course, as you mentioned, dormant economic grievances. So the horizontal relationships are as important as fixing on the thematic project independent initiatives that are taking place, that are taken by countries almost on an everyday basis. How to systematize their effectiveness depends a lot on drawing the appropriate links between the different topics at the national level, and the role of the international community then becomes to lend support to the national initiatives that have proven to be successful.
Thank you, Pablo. And I think that you focused on a couple of issues that also came out in the minister's remarks. One is that we actually do know quite a lot about this, but the knowledge happens both in different domains of people who work in justice, people who work in security, people who work in economic development, and still do not work across those areas sufficiently. And it also occurs very often in successful national examples, where our focus internationally is still much more on the failures than it is on the successes. I hope we'll be able to come back to some of the new areas of evidence that you were talking about in your remarks. It's my pleasure now to go to Vasu. Welcome, Vasu. And it would be great to ask you, since I know you've been working on this, what do you think are some of the benefits of looking at what we know about prevention across different sorts of violence, whether it's conflict, human rights abuses, interpersonal violence, violent extremism, and so forth? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and sorry that I couldn't log on earlier. Ambassador Kimani, I know that you're sitting in New York, but you're probably going to be envious because I'm sitting in Nairobi right now. So I had a few problems logging on. It's got nothing to do with Kenya. It's got everything to do with my laptop. But now that I'm on, Sarah, thank you very much. I think it's good that you ask me to focus on that. Let me start with an anecdote. Last week, I was invited by a psychiatrist friend of mine who happened to open a new psychiatric hospital with 56 beds, together with some private investors in Durban, where I live. And in 8 days, they had filled up the entire 56 beds. Now, that is an indication of the level of mental health issues that we are dealing with in the city that I live in. But that is not just a statistic for the city, that is a statistic for our entire country. And I think that whilst we have had the orientation in South Africa, given our own history of the fight against apartheid, to focus heavily on political violence, which we have had a lot of, as you know, Sarah, yourself, since you've worked in South Africa, that just in the period of the 80s, in the province that I come from, KwaZulu-Natal, which is one province only in South Africa, we lost 20,000 people during that period. So the numbers are high when it comes to political violence. And so understandably, our entire focus in South Africa has always been to look at political violence and to look at violence from the lens of political violence. But what COVID did was bring the stark reality to us of interpersonal violence. Because with millions now being confined to their homes, and with, for the first time, a lot of interpersonal violence now becoming the focal point, we found that we had a different appreciation and understanding of the different types of violence that confront us as a society. So as we know very well, we have criminal violence in South Africa, which is something that is highly prevalent in the country, and that is growing. We have interpersonal violence, violence against women, especially in South Africa, and gender-based violence is a huge issue in South Africa. It's become a major focal point for our president in the last couple of years. And then, as I said, the incidence of mental health that stems from anxiety about uncertainty when it comes to the future, when it comes to financial stress that people are feeling. We are a country, I don't think people tend to focus too much on these types of violence that come from or are the root causes of a lot of the stress and violence that we find in the country. So, for example, our finance minister then, Trevor Manuel, a few years ago, under President Mbeki, was warning the country that we are a consumer country and we are not a saving country. And that at some point, personal debt would be at an astronomical level. We are at that point now, where personal debt is at a very, very high level in South Africa, domestic debt, and that is having an impact on family relationships. And that is leading to violence as well. So I think for the first time as a country, we are beginning to confront not just political violence, and yet at the same time, I have to add that we do continue to have political violence in the country. But we have to understand that, and I think this is the importance of our project of halving global violence by 2030, is that we need to understand that there are a multiplicity of causes of violence in society. And it's not just political violence that we are dealing with. So what then are some of the approaches, and is it possible to then halve global violence by 2030? Is it possible to come up with strategies to deal with violence if we have a multiplicity of causes that are leading to violence in society? And I think from the studies that we've done in the Pathfinders project, we know that Colombia has successfully dealt with this. Brazil has successfully dealt with this. And therefore, there are other countries that can successfully deal with it. So we need to understand, firstly, that it is a multidiscipline, that violence comes from many different avenues, and that therefore there can't be a unidimensional approach. There has to be a multidimensional approach to dealing with the causes of violence. At the root, of course, is livelihoods. And unless we're able to deal with the question of sustainable livelihoods for people, and that's why, Minister, when you talked about men and women, and that an angry man is an angry man and a hungry woman is a resilient woman. We know that when we're talking about sustainable livelihoods, and it's because sustainable livelihoods can address to a large extent a number of the root causes that lead to violence, whether that is political violence, whether that is interpersonal violence, whether that is criminal violence. So at the root of it, we have to go back and say, what are those strategies that we can implement at the local and national level that can lead to mitigating violence? I think in the short term, the best we can hope for is to mitigate violence, but we have to put strategies in place to ensure that over the long term, we can deal with the root causes of violence. And Minister, I was in your country, Sierra Leone, 3 weeks ago, where I had a meeting with your security hierarchy, your head of police, intelligence, military, and border control, coordinated by your national coordinator of security. And we were looking at some of the issues that you're dealing with now throughout our continent, as well as many other developing parts of the world. We are dealing with a huge development deficit and exponential population growth and rapid urbanization. These things coming together are creating huge complexity, and they are leading to violence in many, many different variations. And so what we need to be thinking about is, how do we understand this complexity that we are dealing with, and how then do we not become unidimensional in our focus of dealing with violence, but how then do we deal with violence in a multidimensional way? Sarah, let me stop there, and then I'm happy to take some questions around what I've raised. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasu. I'm sure that there will be. And I was just thinking that since I signaled earlier on time, I had to signal to you on time. But the points that you make are very, very complementary here. I think that there is a strong link between the preoccupations of our security and justice counterparts and the preoccupation on livelihoods, participation and opportunity of people in the street. Martin, it's my pleasure to go to you, Ambassador Martin Kimani, permanent representative of Kenya, and ask you how what you hear relates to your own experience in Kenya, but also working globally on the lessons of what works successfully to prevent violent extremism.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this opportunity, and good afternoon to you all. I will first tell you that on the 22nd of March here in New York, Kenya is going to present independent review of our peace-building architecture to the Peace-Building Commission. And we will do that alongside Norway doing theirs and East Timor. And the idea here is to give an independent review for Kenya that then allows us to see what gaps there are in our prevention work, and then go further to try and improve that. I think it's time we really, the word prevention is very often used here in New York, but a lot of times it's an aspiration. And I think we need to make it very operational and very, very tangible. And that's what I want to share with you. As I think most of you know, Kenya has paid an exceptional price to terrorist violence over the last decade and a half. And we, of course, responded very robustly in security terms. And as our counterterrorism campaigns, which were deeply securitized, or almost entirely security interventions, continued, it became very clear to us, one, that we were just going to fill up our jails, and that this itself was going to create an even greater problem, where you are going to have sort of offenders who have not yet committed violence in the same jail compound with hardened, committed terrorist fighters. And the odds are that that young person who has not yet committed violence may actually travel further to become even more extreme and even more violent when they do leave prison. So we needed a different way. And so we launched in March of 2018, a disengagement program that brought in a variety of players from, of course, government, from different parts of government, from the security agencies, civil society, and experts on the ground. We built this system to its aim to prevent the recruitment of Kenyans into Al-Shabaab and associated terrorist organizations. We based it on the Danish Aarhus model, which is a very famous model. But what we did was to take it and then restructure it to be more relevant to Kenya. From the time we launched it in 2018 with 18 trained personnel, today the disengagement and reintegration program is a nationwide program that involves hundreds of professionals who are all trained and work together to identify and engage young Kenyans who may be at risk of being recruited or who are in the process of being recruited. Now, this has been a crucial intervention by Kenya because we all need to look ahead and ask ourselves, how do terrorist campaigns end? And it's very rare that a terrorist campaign ends with the physical or judicial elimination of the group. Usually it ends at the end of through the delegitimization of that group's message, even amongst its membership. And so how do you do that? Our disengagement system was intended to, of course, help young people who are being recruited to turn away, but secondly, to also better understand the psychological and human terrain that radicalization and recruitment was occurring in. To do that, we established it on several pillars. As I said, there was the training component and the innovation in terms of intellectual property of how to use psychosocial tools in a structured way, how to have a risk assessment framework and use it consistently, and how to build other tools from it. Secondly, we build county action plans for the prevention of violent extremism. Kenya has 47 counties. In all 47 counties, we brought together security officials, civil society, and community leaders to diagnose how were the young people in their county becoming involved in extremism, and what unique strengths did they have as communities to minimize this or stop it completely. So all 47 counties passed them, and a number of county legislatures have written them into law, meaning that they are resourced and budgeted by the county, for instance, in Nairobi County and in Mombasa County. We also created a process within the security services where at the county level and at the sub-county level, a multi-agency committee that protects the security of the area from violent extremists and Al-Shabaab, when they make use of the disengagement system. So when they assess a file, they have to decide, should we continue collecting intelligence on this individual? Do we have enough evidence to charge them in a court of law? Or we don't have evidence, but we think they're on a path to some danger. So let us give them over to the disengagement team. And that whole process is coordinated all the way from the sub-county level to the national level. The process itself of how you bring an individual, the individual is usually identified by a community leader, a church leader, a parent, and they require a great deal of trust in the security services. And that has not always been easy because by and large, over time, many Kenyans were intimidated by approaching the police or approaching other security agencies. So we had to do a lot of messaging to raise the level of confidence and show that disengagement indeed was not a punishment, it was actually an act of care. And so we bring together the intelligence service for vetting, the police, the probation and aftercare services, and the prison services. And we're able to have a sort of very seamless system.
Martin,
so, Sarah, just to share that with you as an instance of success, and today I am pretty sure that the disengagement system has saved lives. And I think that is what we're aiming to do when we talk about prevention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you, Ambassador Kimani. And I think that as with Vasu, Pablo, and Minister Bali's inputs, you really hit on what is working practically here. And what is working is something that is by no means impossible to achieve, but which often are neither our governments nor our international supporters are set up to achieve. And that is to really link the efforts that are in the economic and social areas with the efforts that are political and cultural, to do with the leadership given politically and culturally, and the efforts that are in the security and justice areas. So I'd like to invite people to go to the mic if they would like to direct questions at the panelists. If people could introduce themselves as they do that. I think we have one question there.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Joseph from Father's Attorney Nourious University in the Philippines. My question to the panel, in what ways can civil society organization and the academe collaborate with governments and international bodies to advocate and contribute to a more robust and comprehensive global framework for conflict prevention? Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions there? Please go ahead.
Hello, Paul Andre Wilson from the UK FCDO. A couple of quick questions. One to Ambassador Kimani. What do you hope to achieve with East Timor and Norway that others will follow you through at the PBC? And to the whole panel, how do we measure success in this? Because the SDG goal 16 is a ambitious stretch target. We're pretty close to 2030, and we're looking at all forms of violence. But organizations like the World Bank don't have money for everywhere. So if they're going to focus and target their investment, where should they be doing it? And how will they know if it's working? Thank you.
Please, we'll take a third question and then go back to the panel. Please go ahead.
Thank you. For Ambassador Kimani, you mentioned that when you implemented the prevention strategy, you adapted it to Kenya. Can you give an example of one of those revisions or adaptations that you did to the prevention strategy? Thank you.
Very good. So I have a question also from the chat for Minister Barley, which is on whether she could talk a little bit about intergovernmental coordination in looking at prevention within Sierra Leone's strategy, how to work across government agencies. So just to summarize the questions, and I'll go to Minister Barley first. I think we have questions on local level efforts. Two questions for Ambassador Kimani specifically on East Timor, Norway, and Kenya's presentation on how models from other countries were adapted or revised in Kenya. And then questions I would suggest that Minister Vasu and Pablo look at on how do we measure success? What do we specifically know about some of the newer areas of challenge? And if you were investing in violence prevention, where would be some of the best investments? Minister, let me hand to you first.
Okay, I'll start with the, I think, second question. I have two on the CSO and then also the intergovernmental. Yeah. The second question, it's very interesting because we do tend to work in silos. And as you say, justice sector doesn't talk to probably the economic area or address the social area. But I think that, well, within Sierra Leone, we have the opportunity to coordinate not just, well, the government ministries and the partners. We've got a development partnership framework in which we meet on a quarterly basis around thematic areas. So there's a potential there for that. But I feel that there just needs to be more dialogue in every area, because really we're not talking to one another. And I don't say I have the solution for that. We do have the partnership forum. It's not 100% perfect, but we are working on it. Yeah. Then in the area of what I got from NGOs, how can civil society work with the government to advocate for whatever? You've already given one of the strategies, because civil society are known for to be loud advocates. And loud advocates, sometimes for the downtrodden, loud advocates on best practice. And they also probably have little interventions that can be scaled up in these areas. So I would say that civil society organizations should continue to do what they do. And I think it's more on the part of the government to engage really and open up, because what happens is you do what you do, but you feel left out. And well, for us as a government, we have had considerable engagement with the CSO at every level, and the CSOs, even for the development of the plan. We were in every district with a wide range of stakeholders. And I just think we should just not see ourselves as adversaries, really, but as partners to work together. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister. Pablo, do you want to talk about some of the specific new areas emerging of good practice and effective approaches?
Yes, and in fact, I was very glad that a question about civil society was brought up, and I agree entirely with the comments that the Minister just made. One of the areas of research that the project is taking on is precisely about the contribution of civil society to prevention. And part of the hypothesis that we are trying to establish empirically is that a robust and inclusive civil society is itself a preventive mechanism, independently of the specific functions that different civic society organizations can play: monitoring, advocacy, reporting. An inclusive civil society makes it less likely that certain types of violations will take place. And therefore, this raises a question about what is it that can be done in order to strengthen civil society. On the one hand, civil society is not a part of government, and it doesn't respond to policy making as if it were an instrument of government. And this is one of its virtues, its independence and autonomy. On the other hand, it is a tremendous lack of imagination on our part to say that the only thing that can be done in order to strengthen civil society is, for example, to repeal laws that constrain civic space. There are lots of things that can be done from a policy perspective in order to incentivize civil society, including, for example, things as simple as guaranteeing the safety of activists. I am Colombian. I come from a country in which the fate of civil society organizers is not that great, including environmental defenders. There is an interesting argument to be made in connection with this, having to do with the fact that the murdering of environmental defenders is not only a violation of human rights, but that it diminishes the likelihood of having positive environmental outcomes in the long run. So I am being signaled that I should stop. I will stop here. This is a new area of research. We should pay attention to topics of this sort. It's not just institutional design.
At least I'm being neutral and non-partisan in my signaling. Let me go next to Vasu. Vasu, I think that there were questions here on how do we measure success and where do you invest to have an impact? And I wondered if you might talk a bit about the work done in South Africa on the cost of violence and effective measures to address violence, because I know that was done very much with showing that argument of where do you get a benefit from investment.
Thank you, Sarah. If I fall asleep in between the answers, because it's close to midnight here now. Now, when it comes to the cost of violence in South Africa, the cost is about 10% of our GDP. That's a huge cost to any nation when it comes to having to, the consequences of violence and having to deal with it. I think what can be effective is, in the short term, we have to find mitigation strategies. And that's not just policing. That is ensuring that we have a number of other strategies that can complement policing and other strategies. But in the long term, I think there are many strategies that we can put in place that will help to build more socially cohesive and inclusive societies that results in levels of equity across the society that will reduce the tensions and the impact on individuals through the creation of sustainable livelihood. So that's in the long term. Let me quickly go to measuring success, because I think here, I've been, as you know, Sarah, for the last 32 years now in almost all the conflict situations on the continent. And I've found that the last decade or two, there's become kind of an obsession with measuring success. We are not producing widgets here. And I think this obsession of taking a management tool that somebody thought will be very useful to go and now measure societal phenomenon as totally crazy. How do you measure an investment of $1 trillion in 20 years in Afghanistan and then say, what is success? And in a similar manner, we are dealing with subjective issues with a multiplicity of variables. And so to measure success becomes extremely difficult. And the only thing I can say in that regard is that we can talk about incremental success. And sometimes we will take 10 steps forward and 2 steps back. And sometimes we might take 2 steps forward and 10 steps back. And that's the nature of the beast that we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasu. I couldn't agree more on the point of not trying to measure success in this area as if it was bed nets or a number of school classrooms. But I think that what we can see is what is working when countries successfully navigate situations which in other countries have produced violence, just as Sierra Leone has navigated over the past years since the civil war in a region which has been beset by recurring violence, and we can see that in other country situations. That, in effect, is showing us that something is working correctly, that we have a success. Ambassador Kimani, can I hand over to you, Martin, both the specific questions and anything you wanted to say as we briefly close on the other issues raised?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for the questions. What we're trying to achieve with this presentation to the Peacebuilding Commission, as Vice President of the Peacebuilding Commission, is to, very importantly, to destigmatize countries coming forward to the PBC. And that's why we wanted there to be a Norway, which is famously known to be stable. It has its challenges like all other countries, a Kenya and an East Timor, to present a really different picture and hope other countries come forward, because every single country, no matter how wealthy, needs more peace building work and more prevention work, all the way from the interpersonal all the way to other forms of violence. And what we will do specifically after this review is we will sit down as a government and look at the recommendations in the independent review, work on them, and then hopefully 2-3 years down the line, come back to the PBC and say, this is how we used our independent review. We've tried to strengthen these areas where we saw a weakness, and hopefully more countries will do that. In terms of adapting our disengagement model, there were many aspects of it, but one specific one really stands out, which is we approach disengagement not just as an individual, but we approach their family as well. There's a way that families operate and work together that makes disengagement be a process where you're winning the trust, not just of the individual who you're disengaging, but the people in their life who are most concerned about their safety and their security. And often when those people are aware of what you're trying to do and you are engaging them positively, they themselves gain confidence because they don't want their son or their brother or sister to be in that situation. So I think that's a particular innovation from Kenya. Very quickly, as we have only limited resources, what's the one silver bullet you can use your scarce resources on and have immediate measurable impact? I think it's direct cash transfers that cut down extreme poverty. I think those have such a measurable impact on violence at the level of the family and the community. Thank you very much, Sarah, for inviting me to participate.
Not at all, Martin. Thank you very much. I think that we have a minute left if any others want to make comments on this from the panel. We won't have time for more questions. Minister, anything from your side? I'll let you go, and then I'm going to just direct a question to Vasu as well after the Minister finishes.
Yeah, very briefly, I just wanted to say that in all of this, dialogue needs to be at the core, and continuous dialogue during, we're talking about prevention, but, to prevent it again. And I'll give the example of Sierra Leone. Very recently, there were some violent incidents as a result of the opposition questioning the results of the elections, and they didn't want to participate in governance. But we now are having as I speak, a committee set up for cross-party dialogue. And this had to be mediated from outsiders, from ECOWAS, Commonwealth Secretariat, and other international bodies. But this dialogue is going on, and a lot of issues are being resolved through it. Yeah. So dialogue runs through all, what each of the speakers have been talking about, the need for dialogue.
I think that's absolutely right, Minister. And I was thinking of that when we talked about navigating a situation which in other countries could have led to actual conflict. We need to document that better. Pablo, anything to add from your side? And then Vasu, I was going to ask you a question on direct cash transfers, since obviously South Africa has many. I wanted just to ask you for 30 seconds on that issue. Pablo?
In 30 seconds, I think that I second the idea of dialogue, framing it precisely in different ways. That in the research that we have done on the relationship between the different topics, it is clear that projectizing investments is not the way to achieve a sustainable effects. Therefore, that if one is convinced about the importance of multidimensional responses to violence and to the risks of violence, one has to invest multidimensionally as well. Doesn't mean that everything has to be done at the same time, but it does mean that there is no single measure that can address all problems at the same time.
Thank you, Pablo. Vasu?
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, look, direct cash transfers have worked in some places. So Brazil, for example, it was pretty successful. But you have to be careful. As you know, we have a population of 60 million. We have upwards of 18 million people on social grants and increasing. We have a shrinking tax base, so that's not sustainable. So I think when we talk about cash transfers, we have to talk about two things. We have to talk about subsistence on the one hand, so that it gives people opportunity to survive. But on the other hand, we have to talk about sustainability in the long term. So how do we ensure that cash transfers gives people the opportunity to begin, one, to survive, and two, to begin to develop livelihoods? But that's a complex issue. So I want to just take 1 minute to answer that. Thank you, Sarah.
This shows us, I think, that we could extend, but we have to finish. Martin, I just want to give everyone a chance to come twice. Any last very quick thoughts from you, and then I'll wrap up.
Well, since all of you are down in the World Bank, I'm forced to say that I think the World Bank's fragility work has so much potential. It's very rich as it is, but I think it could become so much more powerful if we link it more effectively to the UN, and especially UN teams on the ground. The World Bank and the UN really are meant, if they work together operationally on the issue of prevention, I think they can save a lot of lives together. And perhaps this year, as we enter the Summit of the Future, we can positively try and build this synergy. And so all of you who are in DC, please help us do this, because together, I think the two, basically this broad umbrella of institutions focused on prevention on the ground can get a lot done. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. I'm just going to sum up perhaps with 4 quick points. So I think we've talked in this panel about violence prevention of all types of violence becoming more central as a challenge. So it's not that this is a new challenge, of course it is not, but there are new conditions happening at the moment. So we see a rise in inequality, a set of repeated international shocks hitting societies, which societies are grappling to deal with internally. New ways of using polarizing narratives, which mix people's economic grievances with their cultural, ethnic, or religious identities, which is being used across many countries of different types, and new situations arising from climate impacts and their links to displacement and violence. In terms of what works, second, I think that we had an excellent discussion, but in an hour, there's obviously only so much you can do. But there were a few common messages there. The need to really think about working across economic and social, security and justice endeavors, and to link those with political and cultural leadership. And there, I think that the last messages on dialogue are extremely important, that you can have very well-designed technical interventions without a dialogue which gets people's ownership and acceptance and appropriation of them. They very often don't work. The government and civil society and community partnerships are extraordinarily important here. There were very good examples from Sierra Leone and Kenya in very different circumstances, but of the need to go to community level to adapt programs, and ditto from South Africa and from Colombia. Third point on how to invest. And here I just want to say that the process that Vasu was referring to, which is a large 2 to 3 year study coming out on how to reduce interpersonal violence, interpersonal and criminal violence, is looking specifically at this question of how to show that you invest in a certain combination of initiatives and it does give you success, and how to document different countries and local municipalities and other areas who have successfully done that around the world. To be launched by 46 member states later in the year, of which Sierra Leone also part in Pathfinders. And then last, I wanted to end with partnerships. That I think on this, it's very important to have several different types of partnerships. We talked about government and civil society. We talked about, and Ambassador Kimani gave a very powerful call on partnerships between the UN and the World Bank. I think one can say more generally with agencies that have the ability to help on the security, justice, political area, and agencies that specialize in development. I would say also partnerships cross-regionally, that this is actually by no means a challenge that is particularly concentrated in one region. Different countries and regions have different patterns and forms, but it really is a challenge that is universal. And we have tended not to have a great deal of engagement, for example, with how Latin America have dealt with their challenge of rising urban violence in the past, and how parts of Asia or Africa now can take some of those lessons of what works and what doesn't to learn from that. So just to say thank you very much, first of all, to our panelists. I thought this was a really wonderful discussion, to those who asked questions and to those who organized the event.